Okay, it looks like we've got critical mass here. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the April meeting of the City Council SCAP Ad Hoc Committee. I'm Brad Eggleston, Director of Public Works for Palo Alto. Touching on our usual housekeeping items for these meetings, we are recording the meeting and we'll post it to the city's website later. We'll send out a link after the meeting, and we are also streaming the meeting now live on YouTube. You can ask questions or make comments in the Zoom Q&A function shown on the screen here. We'll try to, as staff, to answer those questions during the meeting, but even if we're not able to, we will keep track of them and answer them later. Moving on to our agenda for today. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda for today's meeting. We'll have a quick review of the February ad hoc meeting that focused on funding and financing of the SCAP. And then we're going to get into the topic of carbon neutrality and why it's important as we think about really limiting warming globally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We'll have a staff presentation that will also include some short videos about the topic of carbon neutrality. And as shown, we'll take a break roughly in the middle of the presentation, and we'll save questions and comments from our ad hoc committee members and our working group, and then public comment for after the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Sustainability Manager Christine Long.
All right, thank you, Brad. Next slide, please. So, at our February SCAP Ad Hoc Committee meeting, our meeting was focused on funding and financing building electrification. We had 88 participants, plus an additional 5 people watching on our YouTube live stream. And most of the questions covered themes around community costs for building electrification, on-bill financing, different alternatives for funding, available incentives and rebates, and what other incentives and rebates the city could consider offering, and then technical considerations for building electrification. And then we had 2 comments about incentives and rebates and pricing. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Assistant Director of Utilities, Jonathan Attenshein, to talk about carbon neutrality.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jonathan Attenshein. So I'm going to kick off with an introduction of carbon neutrality today. It's a concept that folks have been talking about for the last couple of years since the 2018 IPCC report, but it may be something that some folks haven't heard. So we're going to cover some of the basics here and then move on into some of the technologies that we can use to achieve carbon neutrality. So the basic definition of carbon neutrality means essentially achieving net zero emissions for the community. That means the amount of greenhouse gas that you put into the atmosphere is offset by an equal amount removed from the atmosphere using carbon removal methods like new forest growth, and removing carbon from the air and storing it underground. And because carbon removal methods have limited capacity, achieving carbon neutrality requires some very steep emissions reductions as well. And that's what we've been talking about in most of our sessions to date. But what do you do with that last little bit? And that's what we're going to talk about today. When our 2016 SCAP goal was adopted, California's greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal was to reduce emissions to 80% below 1990 levels. But in September 2018, Governor Brown issued an executive order that was set the goal of trying to achieve carbon neutrality as soon as possible and by 2045 at the latest. And then after that, maintaining negative emissions once that goal is achieved. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a minute. So, I know that most attendees are familiar with why we're trying to take climate action right now, but as we talk about carbon neutrality, I think it's really important for us to just take a moment and remind ourselves of the goals that we're trying to achieve and why they're so important. Holding global warming to 1.5 degrees C or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit average globally is really important because you start to see some really major impacts once you reach 2 degrees Celsius and above. Species face extinction, temperatures rise, and there are a wide range of global and local economic and health impacts, with particular strains on disadvantaged communities, both globally and locally. When we think about keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees C, I think it can help to think of the atmosphere as having a carbon budget. And determining that budget is an immensely complicated and highly uncertain exercise, but scientists have estimates. This animation from Stanford University and its partners shows how much of a budget remains for 1.5 degrees C. So what you're seeing is the growth in carbon emissions from industrialization, especially in Europe and the United States, and that grows. And at this point, we are down to having only 8% of our carbon budget left, or about 10 years at current rates of emissions, which again is why we're talking about the 80 by 30 goals in particular. This is another view of carbon budgets. And it shows the budgets for 1.5, 1.7, and 2 degrees C. We're rapidly approaching the budget for 1.5 and on our way to approaching the budgets for 1.7 and 2. The reason I talk about carbon budgets is to help explain the concept of carbon neutrality. In 2018, the IPCC reported that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, we need to do 3 things. First, we need to greatly reduce emissions. And in practice, this might mean, this might even mean eliminating all fossil fuel use. This is a type of action we've been talking about up until now in all of these ad hoc meetings when we talk about trying to achieve the 80 by 30 climate goals. But reducing emissions as much as possible isn't enough. We also need to get to zero emissions. And since fossil, natural, and other industrial emissions may not be easy or possible to eliminate, we will likely need to take carbon out of the atmosphere to offset it. So to keep warming to 1.5 degrees C, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recommends reaching carbon neutrality by mid-century. But even if we do achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century, it is likely that by that time, we will have exceeded our carbon budget. So if we overshoot this carbon budget, we may need to actually remove some CO2 from the atmosphere. And that means achieving what's called negative emissions for some period of time until atmospheric carbon levels are stabilized. That will be a goal for the latter half of this century, most likely. But essentially what it means is taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we put in for a period of time to start to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Okay, again, I just want to continue to emphasize that reducing emissions is the top priority. We can't lose focus on that. In Palo Alto, we've already made our electricity as green as possible, and now we need to make as many buildings and vehicles as possible run on that green electricity. But some emissions are really hard to reduce. Biofuels and green hydrogen can help, but ultimately some emissions are going to need to be offset by removing carbon from the atmosphere, either through natural methods or mechanical carbon removal. We have, like I said, California has been doing a lot of work on trying to discuss these concepts. And what I'm going to show you here is a discussion by the California Air Resources Board that I think covers the topic really well.
The concept of carbon neutrality is gaining importance. The concept is that to address climate change, the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions generated by sources such as vehicles, power plants, and industrial processes must be less than or equal to the amount of carbon dioxide that is stored both in natural sinks like forests and by mechanical sequestration such as carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. The magnitude of climate change impacts will depend on when carbon neutrality is achieved. In general, limiting warming to just 1.5 degrees C reduces climate-related risks and increases flexibility in mitigation and adaptation options. The IPCC's special report, released in late 2018, finds that to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C, we need to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we need to reach global carbon neutrality by mid-century. The report also indicates that on a global scale, some regions may remain net emitters, while others are better suited to be net sinks. In California, we have an executive order that calls for carbon neutrality by 2045, consistent with the IPCC report. This executive order introduces the concept of balancing carbon emissions and carbon sequestration within the state. The framing of near zero emissions is not sufficient to meet the challenge laid out in the IPCC special report. We need our GHG emissions flux to be at zero or net negative, where we're actually removing more carbon than we emit. So the science is clear on where we need to be. Getting there will require contributions from all sectors. And this means reducing emissions throughout the economy and converting emissions sources to emissions sinks where possible. Several regions have begun to adopt or develop carbon neutrality goals. Each of these efforts involves serious consideration of the unique attributes of the jurisdiction in question. So for example, the European Commission developed a long-term strategy that outlines a vision of the deep economic and societal transformations that would be required, engaging all sectors of the economy and society to achieve the transition to a climate-neutral economy by mid-century. This strategy opens a thorough debate on how the European Union should prepare for a socially fair transition. It's worth noting that this goal is an aggregate goal across 28 member states. Sweden's climate policy framework includes a goal of net zero GHG by 2045 and negative emissions thereafter. Their goal identifies that they need to reduce 85% of their emissions within their borders, but will need to rely on investments in out-of-region actions for balancing the remaining 15% of GHG emissions. Costa Rica is developing plans to offset all carbon emissions, implementing measures to address transportation sector emissions, as well as considering a carbon certificate market. Now, the path to carbon neutrality requires actions on both sources and sinks. Today, we track statewide GHG emissions from transportation, electricity, commercial, residential, industrial, agricultural, and waste management sectors, including high global warming potential gases. We also track emissions and sequestration in our natural and working lands. Currently, these lands are a source of greenhouse gas emissions, releasing more carbon than they are sequestering. Some emissions from the sector are part of the natural cycle and are necessary for healthy systems, including emissions from periodic fires. Today, California emits GHGs from fossil energy and industrial sectors, as well as from our natural and working lands. So to achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century, we must minimize emissions from our fossil energy and industrial sources, and transition our natural and working lands from a source to a sink, such that we achieve net negative greenhouse gas emissions. And as we start to consider the concept of carbon neutrality, our starting point is CARB's existing accounting framework, which includes all major greenhouse gas emissions and not just carbon dioxide. CARB's 2017 scoping plan established a...
Okay, and the presentation goes on, but that was really, I think, the most relevant part for our conversation this morning. What I really want to emphasize here, though, is about the state's actions on carbon neutrality. First off, again, you'll see their primary focus, like ours, is on reducing emissions from electricity, gasoline, and natural gas, primarily through electrification and green electricity. But they expect that as the state electrifies, they begin to need to focus on biofuels and hydrogen to start cutting into some of those emissions that are more difficult to electrify. And we're talking about things like trucking or certain industrial process emissions. And in the end, the state is not projecting that they're going to reach zero emissions just through eliminating fossil fuels and using biofuels. There's going to need to be some carbon dioxide removal for those last challenging emission sources. Fortunately, there are smart people who are studying how to remove carbon from the atmosphere. In 2020, Lawrence Livermore National Labs released a study on how California could reach carbon neutrality, removing carbon to offset those last emissions. And the study was titled Carbon Neutrality, Options for Negative Emissions in California. And here's the video overview.
It's Earth Day 2020, and earlier this year, Lawrence Livermore National Lab published a report finding that all of California could become carbon neutral by 2045. That sounds pretty amazing, but how are we gonna accomplish something that ambitious? What's the plan? First of all, what does carbon neutral mean? Simply put, it means removing as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as you put into it. So even if, say, our cars emit 1 ton of CO2, we're also putting measures in place to remove that 1 ton of CO2 so we end up with net zero carbon emissions, or carbon neutrality. And the report put forward by LLNL's Carbon Initiative finds that we think we can achieve carbon neutrality sooner than we thought, that it will cost less than we expected, all while boosting the economy and creating jobs all over the state. The plan has 3 pillars that support this goal of carbon reduction. Pillar 1, capture and store carbon through natural and working lands. This means maximizing our natural spaces to uptake carbon. All plants essentially inhale CO2 and exhale oxygen as part of photosynthesis. So this piece of the puzzle involves increasing forest health with the restoration of woodlands, grasslands, and wetlands, letting us increase the amount of carbon that can be naturally taken up and stored by trees and soils. Pillar 2, convert waste biomass to fuels and store CO2. California actually generates about 56 million tons of waste biomass per year. That's 20-ish football stadiums stuffed to the brim with stuff like agricultural waste, sewage and manure, logging byproducts, and the byproducts of fire prevention activities. Right now, this biomass returns its carbon to the atmosphere when it decays or when it burns in prescribed fires or wildfires, or it is used to produce energy at a power plant that just vents its carbon emissions, like lets them go into the atmosphere. But if we could use this biomass instead to make fuel, like hydrogen fuel, say, and then capture the carbon produced during that process, then LNL estimates that this pillar, Pillar 2, has the largest promise for CO2 removal at the lowest cost. And finally, Pillar 3, implement direct air capture and CO2 storage. This involves human-made machines that directly suck existing carbon dioxide out of the air. This technology actually already exists, and while it is a more expensive option, it will become less expensive as it becomes more widely used. The CO2, after it's captured, is stored safely deep within the earth, much in the same way that existing oil and natural gas deposits are already naturally stored. This all involves exciting challenges in technology development for the capture itself, for transportation of the CO2, and for storage of that carbon. All areas in which Lawrence Livermore has made and is continuing to make big strides. Now, of course, CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas, right? There are other chemicals that we humans and our activities, like agriculture, emit into the atmosphere. And these basically insulate our planet and cause the climate to change faster and more drastically than it would without our input. And we should also say that the LNL report is not the complete plan for the state, which already has laws and plans in place to get us 80% of the way there. But these findings from LNL can just get us across that finish line. Because by building toward these 3 pillars of carbon reduction, the lab estimates that California can remove something on the order of 125 million metric tons of CO2 per year from the atmosphere by 2045. Bringing us to carbon neutral and making us even more of a world leader in climate change mitigation than we already are. This report is so exciting because it provides real, actionable steps that we can take to not only protect this beautiful planet, but also human property and human life, because the planet will be here long after we're gone. The question just is, how many more Earth days like this do we want to be able to see?
So there's more that you can follow on their website, but I wanted to just stop there and move on. But as you can see, there are folks thinking carefully about how the state could move towards carbon neutrality and the types of technologies that it would take to do that.
We'd love to make more videos.
Now, one of the first pillar that was mentioned in the presentation was using natural and working lands to sequester carbon. And scientists have said that so this is a complex and really varied area for examination, and there's far more work being done in this area than I think we could cover in one morning. But one movement that's really taking hold globally and in California is 30 by 30. Scientists have said that we need to protect 30% of lands and coastal waters by 2030, both to protect biodiversity and to combat climate change. Like I said, this is an international movement that's intended to use conservation to achieve those goals. There are over 70 countries, including the United States, that have signed on to the 30 by 30 pledge. California has signed on as well and has been planning actions to achieve this goal through its natural and working land strategy document. A draft was released in October of last year, and it covers all of the different types of ecosystems across California, all of the different regions across California, including looking at what needs to be done in every location and what partners are working to achieve different types of biodiversity goals. I think it's helpful to get a high-level overview of what can be done with natural working lands. And fortunately, we have local experts in this topic, and including Professor Chris Fields at Stanford University. And so what I have for you here is a video from a webinar at Stanford University where, and I've excerpted a section. So this is a webinar that was done back in 2020 on atmospheric carbon removal, titled Atmospheric Carbon Removal at the Gigaton Scale. And you can see the whole video on Stanford's website. I've included the links, but this excerpt is a really good overview by Professor Chris Fields about natural opportunities with natural and working lands.
Thanks, Ajay. So now that we have set the stage for the dual challenge of needing more energy in the future, as well as the need for atmospheric carbon removal, let me switch to Chris now, and let's go a little deeper. The world of atmospheric carbon removal can be divided into two interlinked categories. One is natural climate solutions that harnesses the natural cycles of CO2, and the other is engineered or hybrid solutions. There is a paper that came out in 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by Bronson, Griscom, and 31 other authors that laid out all the options for natural climate solutions. So Chris, give us an idea of the most promising options and the likely challenges that it will face.
Sure. Well, Arun, the critical starting point is that plants, and trees, and grasses, and shrubs, and crops are a wonderful advanced technology for CO2 uptake. the process of photosynthesis using energy from the sun to fix atmospheric CO2 into carbohydrate, more plant, is something that evolution has been working on for more than 1 billion years, works efficiently. And in contrast to all of the engineered technologies, the infrastructure for photosynthesis is self-assembling. You plant a seed and it grows into a plant, and a bunch of plants grow into a forest without need for large amounts of human intervention. And that means that photosynthesis can operate at very low cost relative to the engineered solutions. But the challenge with any of the solutions that depend on photosynthesis, plant growth to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, they take large amounts of land area, and they take large amounts of water and nutrients, the things that everybody understands you need in order to grow plants. So in order to take full advantage of these natural climate solutions, basically what we need to do is increase the ratio of uptake of atmospheric CO2 by photosynthesis relative to the loss from harvesting and wildfires and decompositions. And Griscom and his colleagues looked at every place in the world where we have the opportunity to, you can think about it as doing a better job of managing ecosystems. And they came up with a maximum potential, kind of independent of cost, but focusing on all the areas that we don't need for food production, or for urban areas or other necessary land uses. It came up with a really big number. They argue that we could, in principle, deploy photosynthesis-based or natural climate solutions for about 23 billion tons of CO2 per year. This is about half of current emissions. And more impressively, they calculated that if we had $100 a ton that we could spend on deploying these solutions, we might still get a little bit better than 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. So a really substantial amount of the carbon problem could be managed through these natural climate solutions if we're willing to make the kind of commitment that's represented by $100 a ton carbon price.
So I was, when reading that paper, I was struck by the fact that the lowest hanging fruit in terms of scale and low cost, on the order of less than 100 or maybe tens of dollars a ton, is the increase in food productivity. What is the deeper connection between food and carbon removal? And the follow-up to that would be, there's a lot of interest in this plant-based diet, in things like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. Do they make sense?
A striking feature of our greenhouse gas budget overall is that about a quarter of greenhouse gas forcing of climate comes from food, agriculture, and other land use. Some of that is methane from cattle and wetlands. Some of it is nitrous oxide from fertilizer management. And quite a lot is still from deforestation, which is occurring especially in the tropics. So there's definitely a big footprint of especially meat-based agriculture, a forcing of climate change, and any decrease in preference for meat could make a real difference in that. When we think about natural climate solutions that are related to agriculture, there are really two kinds of solutions that look like they make a lot of sense. One is changing agriculture so that it can store more carbon in the agricultural fields and doing a better job with soils. And no-till agriculture is an example of a way to increase the organic matter in soils. But an even more powerful set of approaches is what you have implied, Arun, that it involves increasing the productivity of our existing ag estate so that we don't need so much land and can return some of that land to forest and other natural ecosystems that have the potential to store dramatically more carbon. And this is a very tricky challenge. We've already spoken about the expected increase in human population and the expected increase in food that is going to entail. But at the same time, we have had a history of dramatic successes in increasing the productivity of our agriculture lands. And I think a realistic but ambitious goal for the future is to be able to meet the food needs of the growing human population without increasing the amount of land that's used for agriculture. Personally, I'll be surprised if we can dramatically decrease the amount of land we need to use for agriculture, unless there's a societal shift in the preference for meat. And it's intriguing to see the popularity of the meat alternatives like Impossible and Beyond Meat. And it will be intriguing to see if in the future, as societies get to be more and more wealthy, the demand for meat-based diets continues to increase. I think that if we were to say, what's the cheapest, healthiest step that we could all take in order to address climate change, shifting that dietary preference is way high on the list.
So Chris, what you're saying is that we need, sort of using a historical analog, we need another green revolution of the form of Norman Borlaug that happened in the 1960s. In addition, a change of diet towards plant-based would be, the combination of that could be very powerful. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the green revolution has been totally transformative in providing sufficient calories to meet the world's needs. And we will be doing all we can if we can sustain the kind of productivity increases, the 1% to 2% year-on-year increases in ag outputs that we've seen over the last half century. A major challenge for the future is figuring out how to sustain those productivity increases, especially in the context of a changing climate that in many cases is making habitats less suitable for reliable food production.
Just to the audience, I know there are a lot of questions about that reference for the paper. I will put that when the student section comes on, but I just want to move on to another question for Chris. There is more carbon in the soil than in the atmosphere and oceans combined. You can correct me if I'm wrong. We are living in the golden age of biology with gene editing tools that are being not only developed but applied to agriculture. Couldn't we use modern biotechnology to not only increase food productivity, but also put more carbon in the soil by, for example, deeper roots with higher lignin content? So tell us a little bit about soil and what are the uncertainties about soil? Do we really understand them? And is that a viable option going on in the future?
Yeah, let me just say one thing. There's way more carbon in the oceans than there is in soil. Several orders of magnitude more carbon in the oceans. And when we talk about the historical carbon cycle, the big players are of course the ocean and the amount of carbon that's in rocks. But it is in fact true that there's substantially more carbon in the soils than there is in either the atmosphere or in above ground plants. And we don't usually think about the soils as the big player in the carbon cycle. The reason for that is that the turnover of soil organic matter tends to be quite slow. It's typically on a scale of several centuries. But there's been a huge amount of interest, some of it at the stage of speculation, but some at the stage of real experimentation, that if we could simply increase the fraction of current primary production that stays in the soil on a year-by-year basis by a fraction of a percent, it could make a big difference in building climate solutions, in removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And there are a whole bunch of kinds of steps we can take. One of the most attractive features of steps to increase soil carbon is that they also tend to increase soil fertility and provide the kind of win-win that we look for, especially in natural climate solutions. So steps like decreased tillage, growing crops that have higher yields, potentially genetically engineering crops so that they're less susceptible to, that the residues are less susceptible to decomposition. The important thing to remember about soil organic matter is that it's not mostly about the stabilization of dead plants. It's about a huge biome of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, and when we talk about soil organic matter, it's usually the bodies of these fungi and bacteria that are the bulk of the material and their waste products. And so we can't just turn a switch and say, okay, we're going to make different plants and they'll stay in the soil much longer. But we are beginning to get enough of an understanding of the richness of this below ground ecosystem that we can begin to start tweaking it. My personal sense is that even though we should be putting a lot of attention on asking what could be done there, the fact that soil carbon pools tend to go up and down relatively slowly means it's going to be hard to get high rates of flux into soils on the global scale.
So when you step back from all the complexities and the opportunity in natural climate solution, is that sufficient to address atmospheric carbon removal at the scale that we need? Or what are you, I mean, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic?
Well,
what are the uncertainties?
Yeah, so let me say that probably the most important natural climate solution that we have access to that we haven't spoken about today is slowing and then stopping the cutting of forests, especially tropical forests. And there are tremendous benefits in terms of habitat, biodiversity, air and water quality that can come from slowing tropical deforestation. And in many cases, the financial resources that are necessary to do that are not all that great, especially if they're coupled with political will, as we saw, for example, in Brazil in the early years after 2000. But still, if you add up everything that we can expect to accomplish with natural climate solutions, even with the abundant co-benefits that we expect to be able to obtain, we'll still only be taking a slice of the overall climate challenge, and a slice, probably less than a quarter of the total amount of CO2 removal that we'll want to do during the 21st century. So as is the case with almost everything in climate change, we need to look at a portfolio of natural climate solutions as part of a broader portfolio of CO2 removal technologies, which are only part of the portfolio of climate change solutions.
Thank you, Chris.
So I think the way Professor Fields summed it up there right at the end really kind of brings it home. Natural solutions are really, really important. They are some of our lowest cost solutions, but they're only one piece of a very large portfolio of carbon reduction options that we need to explore. And carbon reduction is, of course, just one small piece of all the emissions reductions and other steps that we need to take to achieve carbon neutrality and combat global warming. So I want to turn it back to Director Eggleston, and we can talk about what sort of a break the committee would like to take right now.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, and also to our guest speakers via these very informative videos. We're not that far into our meeting, but still we've planned a break. So why don't we take one and plan to come back at 9:50? That'll give us 10 minutes. Okay, we are back from our break, returning. So I will turn it back over to Assistant Director Attenshein.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, so as Professor Fields noted in the video we watched before the break, natural and working lands are just one piece of the portfolio of carbon removal technologies that we need to use to achieve carbon neutrality. So let's talk about some of those other tools. Green hydrogen or biohydrogen, and just to be clear, green hydrogen is hydrogen from electrolyzing water, while biohydrogen is generating hydrogen from biomass. These can be important ways to reduce emissions where combustion is still needed. And we hear a lot about hydrogen passenger vehicles, but hydrogen might end up playing more of a role in commercial fleets, trucking, and industrial processes, types of things that are hard to run on electricity. The diagram I'm showing here is a conceptual sketch of the Northern California Pacific Hydrogen Hub, which is a potential regional hydrogen hub funded in part by the 2021 Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Northern California Power Agency, which is the electric joint powers agency that the city's electric utility belongs to, as well as a number of other Northern California publicly owned utilities. NCPA is partnering with PG&E, UC Riverside, and the city of Lodi and others in testing foundational technologies and processes that can support this hub in the long term. But I think, as you can see here, the scale of these types of projects really demonstrates how important partnerships are when it comes to looking at alternative fuels and carbon dioxide removal. These are really big projects. In addition to hydrogen, biofuels like biomethane and renewable diesel will be important. These fuels are created by taking biomass like forests, municipal, and agricultural wastes and transforming them through one of various processes into natural gas or other biofuels. Now, this process alone can be carbon neutral if it's done carefully, meaning that it has no net emissions. The CO2 emitted when making biofuels should be about the same as the CO2 that's absorbed by the biological wood, municipal, or agricultural waste when it was grown. But as the Lawrence Livermore study noted, we can make biofuels carbon negative by capturing the CO2 generated when the biofuels are manufactured and storing it underground. And the technologies, when you capture that carbon, that biological carbon, and then store it underground and take it out of the atmosphere, the technologies are generally called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And they feature really heavily in the Lawrence Livermore Getting to Neutral plan, which is not the only plan or approach out there. And I say that in part because the technology does have side effects. It can be really challenging to capture waste streams to feed a bioenergy plant. For example, capturing agricultural waste that's spread across a wide area, or forestry waste, bringing it to a carbon capture or a bioenergy plant. You have to watch also that the carbon emissions that you generate in collecting all of this waste or transporting the waste doesn't outweigh the benefits that you're getting from transforming it. It's also challenging to transfer CO2 to a secure geological location for storage. This can require large pipelines and a lot of large-scale coordination between different agencies and different companies. So these are really large-scale projects that need to be strategically planned. So they really do achieve these emissions reductions. These processes can also involve other types of criteria pollutants. So they need to be really carefully designed and cited. And there is an equity issue there that needs to be kept in mind in terms of citing. And these are, and of course you need that coordination for transporting the CO2 for storage as well. And according to Lawrence Livermore, California does have quite a bit of space available for underground storage. And the infrastructure to capture and store CO2 could support other technologies like direct air capture. There are several other technologies that are being investigated right now. I'll talk about one of them, but there are other technologies like mineralization and natural carbon sinks that are also out there. Let's talk about direct air capture for a moment. In direct air capture plant, CO2 is removed directly from the air using industrial processes or mechanical processes. And then, just like in a bioenergy plant, the captured CO2 is stored underground. The technology requires a lot less land area than bioenergy with carbon capture, but it uses really significant amounts of energy to pull that carbon dioxide from the air, and it costs a lot more. And the technology is really meant just to remove carbon dioxide. It doesn't create biofuels or any other useful byproducts that can be used to offset the cost of the project, like a bioenergy with carbon capture and storage plant can. You just get the captured CO2 itself, which has some economic benefit, but there's far more that you would pull out of the air than is needed for most industrial processes. So where can carbon be stored in California? As I noted before, Lawrence Livermore identified a range of areas in California. These are often oil fields where carbon can be stored on the underground. The map here on the right, the blue areas in the map on the right show areas in California that could be suitable for underground storage. It's a very high level assessment. There of course would have to be a lot of investigation done. And then on the left, there's a lot of lines on the left, but the big one to pay attention to is the dark red line running down the center. That is in the Lawrence Livermore study, the large scale carbon CO2 pipeline that they envision transporting carbon dioxide from a network of bioenergy and direct air capture plants to those high potential underground sequestration sites. Here we see the cost for these various technologies summarized by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And again, I'm just going to say these are really uncertain costs, as you can see in these really wide ranges that they have on this chart. And just for some context, retrofitting single-family homes, I'd say most single-family home emissions in Palo Alto could be removed for under $200 per metric ton of carbon saved, and in many cases for significantly less if you were to do it carefully, and those costs will likely decrease as technology improves and installation processes improve. Electric vehicles are a net savings per metric ton. So by comparison to all the other emissions reduction opportunities we have right now, carbon dioxide removal technologies are fairly expensive, even natural and working land solutions. So again, this is just to reemphasize that we want to use them after all these other emissions reduction options are exhausted, but they will be a critical part of achieving carbon neutrality. Okay, so here I just wanted to take a minute and talk a little bit about some things that Palo Alto can do. First off, the state is taking a lot of actions on carbon neutrality, and there are a number of things they're doing that we may want to be following. First off, the 2022, every few years, the Air Resources Board updates what it calls its climate change scoping plan. And it's in the middle of doing the 2022 update right now, and that should be done in the summer. And this is the first one where they're going to really take a hard look at how to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. So I think we're going to want to follow the work that's being done there. I mentioned already the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy. Again, this was a really extensive and complete survey of the ways that we can reduce emissions and increase sinks from natural and working lands. And it covers all the regions across the U.S., so we can follow the types of landscapes and the work that's being done in the Bay Area and see where Palo Alto can partner. It looks like there will be a lot of follow-on work on this report. The Low Carbon Fuel Standard program has been providing credits of as much as, prices have been in the ballpark of $200 per metric ton, depending on market prices fluctuate, but it's a program that's mostly known for providing a carbon market for making fuels greener. But they also provide credits for carbon capture and storage, including from biofuel manufacturing and direct air capture as well. And so there's a program, an active program right now that will provide some level of funding for these types of projects. SB 1440 is something that we're only passingly familiar with, that we need to take a look at. This is a law that required biomethane procurement by the investor-owned gas corporations. I think it would be good to see what they're being required to procure and at what pace, to understand what that would look like in the context of Palo Alto's gas utility. And then I've just included these last two, AB 74 and SB 100, because they're prompting studies on how to completely eliminate carbon from transportation and electricity, which is really challenging to do. And I mentioned it because it involves that getting those last emissions out requires extensive use of biofuels and hydrogen. And now I would like to turn it over to our sustainability manager, Christine Luong, to talk a little bit about some studies that we've done in partnership with some Stanford students.
Thanks, Jonathan. So this past term, we were fortunate enough to be able to work with a Stanford public policy practicum team of 6 undergraduate students who are listed here, who evaluated strategies and scenarios for carbon neutrality for the city. They used the assumption that Palo Alto would meet our 80 by 30 goal, and focused on different options for nature and technological-based carbon sequestration to help the city achieve the remaining 20% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in order to achieve carbon neutrality. They looked at best practices in carbon neutrality by public agencies, the potential of the urban canopy compared with technological interventions. They looked at industrial carbon removal technologies currently available or in development, and provided recommendations for strategies that we could use to try to get to a carbon neutrality target. And I want to take a minute to point out that our 80 by 30 goal, 80% reductions is just a measurement at a certain point in time. Emissions reductions will continue beyond 2030. They're not just going to stop at 80% by 2030. The emissions reductions will continue. So just to keep that in mind as we're discussing all of this. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows what the team evaluated. So the team evaluated a broad range of options, looking at interventions within Palo Alto boundaries and outside of Palo Alto. They also scored all the options on criteria such as carbon dioxide sequestered, equity, lifestyle emissions, resource conservation, public health, land use, and commercialization. So the strategies listed here were the ones out of all the strategies that they researched that scored the highest in their model with all those different criteria. They included both options within the city and outside of the city, just to see, what mix of strategies we could employ. And I want to just clarify so you can see the first thing that they have on this list is the current urban canopy. And they estimated that the city's current urban forest sequesters an estimated 29,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, although depending on the methodology used, the range is 29,000 to 49,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide sequestered. And this is the entire existing current urban canopy. So they did not compare that to our 1990 baseline and to see what the canopy was in 1990. So this 18.5% is a little high because it doesn't take into account the canopy that was in existence in 1990. And including all of this naturally occurring sequestration does lower the amount of additional action needed but the protocol for including these estimates does not currently exist, and that's why we don't currently do it. We're still waiting for guidance from CARB on how to account for these types of naturally occurring sequestration. And I'd also like to point out that the team did look at what, if we expanded our urban forest, how much potential that could be for sequestering additional carbon. So assuming that we meet our 80 by 30 goal, as you can see, if you add up the carbon sequestration potential of all of the recommended strategies, it gets us to about 43% of the remaining 20% of emissions reductions needed to get to carbon neutrality. And what this shows is that we need to prioritize greenhouse gas emissions reductions because the current sort of recommended strategies for carbon sequestration isn't quite enough to get us to carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. So as Jonathan mentioned before, the state's carbon neutrality target is to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. And that is based on the Paris Agreement, which calls for preventing average global temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And as Jonathan mentioned, holding the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius will require carbon neutrality by mid-century. So this here is a snapshot of California cities that have already adopted carbon neutrality goals. And these are their targets for carbon neutrality. This slide does not mean that they know how to reach carbon neutrality by these years. These are their targets. And so some of these cities have, for example, greenhouse gas reductions of 50% by 2030, and then plan on using offsets and carbon sequestration to get to carbon neutrality. So this is just a snapshot of the other cities that have already adopted these types of carbon neutrality targets, just so you all have an idea of what our neighbors are doing. And next slide, please. So now we've finished our staff and guest presentations and would like to turn over the meeting to the ad hoc committee for their feedback.
Chair Burt.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and I was making notes on your presentation. Thank you. At this time, questions from our working group or ad hoc committee. Is that our next step, Brad or Christine?
Yeah, I think we were going to the ad hoc first and then the working group, but we can structure it that way as well.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and open it up to both the working group and the ad hoc. And so people just want to raise their hand. We'll, Diane, go right ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for this excellent presentation and kind of the recap of the wonderful work from Lawrence Livermore Labs. I really appreciate the caveat at the end that all of these actions taken together to remove carbon are just really not enough to help the city of Palo Alto reach its goals, but they're so important to look at. And I'm really glad to hear that there's sort of a computational aspect to see, you know, could it get 2% of the way there, or how much can be done locally? I really worry about relying on reforestation efforts, given that California has seen a 5-fold increase in the acreage of forested lands that have burned due to climate change. I worry about strategies like biodiesel or biofuels that there are some really destructive practices in current biodiesel generation and use, clearing of rainforests to produce large-scale palm oil plantations and things like that that are sort of counter to our efforts. And so I think, while it's admirable to try to increase our biofuel usage, it's really important to look at the sourcing and make sure that there are not unintended consequences. To date, the consequences have been pretty severe. There are limited supplies of used waste grease locally that can be tapped, but they can only meet a very small amount of demand. Nevertheless, it's worth looking into. I really worry about anything, the BECCS or BECCS, the combination of bioenergy with CCS and storing CO2 underground, particularly if that was to be done in an urbanized area. I worry about the safety considerations of jamming a gas under pressure underground and how stable and long-term that is. And I would love to see a lot more attention to mineralizing CO2 into calcium carbonate or potassium carbonate. These are really important industrial commodities. And I see a lot of promise in reusing them into consumer products and also into building products like concrete and cement. And I'm not sure that was incorporated in the analysis here, but those are things where Palo Alto as a city could establish really important policies to require the use of some of these building materials that have mineralized CO2. And so there are some consumer products out there that are considered carbon negative or carbon neutral because of the use of mineralized CO2 products. I don't want to take up this call to discuss those more, but just to say that I hope that those become part of the policy discussion, but ultimately shouldn't distract from what I view as a really important focus area, which is direct carbon mitigation and reducing our fossil fuel use. And the last thing I wanted to know is that it was really interesting hearing the discussion about regenerative agriculture. I'm not sure how much of that occurs in Palo Alto, but then in terms of the food that we consume, if there is any institutional food purchasing that is done by the city of Palo Alto, that's one opportunity where the city can look at changing the procurement guidelines to avoid meat or high carbon products for any institutional foods. I'm not sure if that would apply to local schools, hospitals, jails, or what level of institutional food purchasing occurs, but that is one opportunity to try to eliminate the purchasing and consumption of high carbon foods. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm not seeing anyone else. Oh, Debbie, go right ahead. You there, Debbie?
You're on mute, Debbie.
Okay, sorry. It was very informative. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I tried to get down some of the takeaways from the different presentations. What I'm getting out of it is, indeed, we need to work much more, as Diane said, on reduction, direct reduction. Some of the specifics I did get down from one of Jonathan's slides is that the carbon sequestration is expensive, and that most methods are more expensive than the estimated $200 per metric ton for residential electrification. So that's, pretty much points to that as an important way to go. Christine's slides about the Stanford student study showing that if those all worked out, we'd get to 43% of the last 20%. So that was sort of like an estimated, we could maybe get to 90% altogether, I guess. And again, I think Christine's takeaway was that we'll be more effective if we can address the reduction again. The Stanford presentation also, as Diane pointed out, really looks to the issue of agricultural practices like no-till agriculture and the significance in a decrease in meat consumption. And I was thinking, as Diane thought, maybe it's something that the city could look into in its purchasing processes. The last number of slides, too, about the cities that have picked dates to achieve 100% carbon neutrality is interesting. Menlo Park, go, 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 2030. But Menlo Park is also in good company with Irvine, which is medium-sized city, but Los Angeles and San Jose. You know, you're thinking about the magnitude of the numbers of people and the amount of carbon emitted by places like Los Angeles and San Jose. If they could make 20 by 30, we ought to be able to. So anyway, this is a really good presentation. Thank you very much for this.
Great, thanks. And Justine.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to give kudos to Jonathan and Christine for presenting on such a technologically complex topic. I want to underscore what Debbie said in terms of the cost of the carbon capture and storage. $400 to $1,000 per metric ton is amazing. One assumption I wanted to question is when bioenergy with carbon capture and storage was presented as a large-scale project that assumes it's difficult to electrify the trucking industry and industrial processes. Many of you are probably familiar with Mark Jacobson's Solutions project, where he and his grad students modeled 100% electrification for everything in our society. So I just wonder if there's a contradiction there. So can we electrify the trucking industry and industrial processes? Obviously that needs to happen at a state, federal level. That's not something Palo Alto can force to happen, but I just wouldn't assume that those two industries can't be electrified, given that Mark Jacobson modeled that. So I just wanted to share that and thank everybody for a great presentation.
Well, I'll go ahead and wade in on a few aspects. First, I thought it was a really valuable presentation because these are complex issues and it framed things going forward. One of the things that I would recommend is that we don't think of first that electrification as our primary focus is that these alternatives are a choice between electrification and the very aggressive approach we have, or not doing that. They're complementary in my mind. One overlays the other with the biggest need to be on the decarbonization through electrification. That's the primary focus. Second is that the idea that these technologies are how we go to carbon neutrality after we hit 80-30. I don't necessarily think of it that way. They can be an overlay, that they can be in parallel so that it is helping us achieve the 80-30 perhaps, not at a grand scale, probably in that time frame, but it's not necessarily sequential in terms of their contributions. And I wanted to also first echo one of the things that Diane brought up of, you know, the CO2 sequestration in storage is one approach, but there are movements really happening in mineralization, essentially creating synthetic aggregate for concrete that is really exciting, that takes concrete from being the 7% of the world's CO2 emissions to it being a carbon negative technology. And one of the most significant players is the company Blue Planet, that has had their significant pilot facility right down at Moss Landing, where they had done much of their R&D. Mitsubishi is entering into significant investments with them to attempt to scale that technology, and whether it's them or others, these are really exciting areas. And then within that list of technologies that the Stanford class had identified as prospects for Palo Alto, first, I don't anticipate that we'd be doing that whole set of technologies within our city, but there are certain ones that are perhaps more feasible and more advantageous than others. The biochar, which for those who aren't really familiar with it, biochar is actually one of the two byproducts of the pyrolysis process. So pyrolysis is thermal decomposition of organic materials in the absence of oxygen. So it's high temperature, it's not burning. So it's in essentially an oxygen-free environment. And so you don't have CO2 emissions from it. And you get basically two different byproducts, a biogas or a biodiesel. So think of it as a form of this renewable natural gas that can then be used for other purposes, including running fuel cells as a baseline power source. But then the biochar itself captures this carbon in a very long-term time frame, and it's an agricultural amenity. So it actually helps promote that agricultural productivity that we heard Chris Fields talked about. And there are within that field, you really have to look at the source of the material, the feedstock. And as Justine was talking about, looking at transportation of that is certainly a big factor. Biochar has been used for dealing with agricultural waste and forest products, but there's an emerging sector now that is using bio waste or bio sludge as the feedstock for biochar technologies. And I think that is one of the most promising ones. San Luis Obispo is moving aggressively on that. That's actually part of their climate plan, and a number of companies and cities are starting to move toward commercialization of that. But within that context, and this was alluded to in I think Jonathan's presentation, is that there are certain things that we can do within our borders as a city, but we should be thinking sub-regionally in some of these things where we may have a consortium of peninsula cities or wastewater treatment plants that work together on a single combined facility for a given technology. And that opens up additional land availability depending on what it is, and economies of scale. And those are the sorts of partnerships that I think may be really appropriate going forward. And I would also just like to comment on concerns that Diane and others have raised about some of the technologies, things like renewable natural gas. And there's been a concern that, well, that's potentially a form of like greenwashing of methane companies wanting to continue their operations by integrating a small portion of that. And that's certainly a valid concern, but that's not the only approach that is feasible. Denmark, for instance, which is a large agricultural country, they've been aggressively electrifying and aggressively reducing their use of methane while they've been increasing their supply and proportion of renewable natural gas. So now their reduced amount of natural gas or methane use that they have is now up to 25% of that whole mix is renewable. And their plan is to continue to move in that direction of declining use of natural gas, and the remainder of the methane become from renewable resources. It's not their primary focus. Their primary focus is electrification through renewable energy. But it's complementary and important to really get as far to where we need to go and to get as much progress as quickly as possible. So those were my thoughts on it. And anyone else wish to wade in? Let's see. Oh, good. I scrolled back. I couldn't see all the hands at once. So Lincoln, go right ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I want to pick up, kind of synthesize a lot of the things that we've been talking about, the way they've come together in my mind, and that is that we have a tremendous universe of possibilities here, and clearly the portfolio effect, the kind of all of the above or many of the above approach is the one that has the most impact. And so the analysis, or at least the structure of the next step in my mind, might look something like on one axis, the feasibility for a solution, and on the other axis, a cost for that solution, and looking at what's possible within Palo Alto, but also, Pat, to your point, what's possible regionally on a consortium basis, and really starting to identify what would essentially be the low-hanging fruit that came out of that sort of analysis. And again, looking at it not as a single silver bullet, but as a portfolio of possibilities, some of which may work out, some of which may not, some of which may be on a steeper cost curve, on a steeper effectiveness efficiency curve than others. But really, I think we're getting closer to a point where we can really drill down on here are the dozen, or here are the half a dozen that we think might actually really be a fit for the wants and needs of Palo Alto. And because there's clearly a lot out there. And, as we've been talking about, this sort of portfolio approach, diversification approach is not only probably the lower risk way to go, but also the higher impact way to go. So I'm really excited about bringing these down and saying, okay, here's our dirty dozen, or our clean dozen. Forget dirty dozen, our clean dozen, that we can really start to dig into. Oh, thank you.
Thanks. And Allison?
Thanks, Pat. I want to start by complimenting Mr. Attenshein on his really effective use of experts. I think we probably underutilize video technology, and there's no reason for those people to give the same lecture repeatedly. So thanks for doing the research and picking the right people in the right amount of time on the topics. I also want to say a big thank you to the Stanford students who, spent an entire quarter working on what are the options available to us, and helping us really begin the process of identifying these other solutions, and think about which ones are we going to want to spend some more time on to further develop. It's a gift to us, and thanks to them for really making a local action on this global problem. I think the Lawrence Livermore study crystallized for me a question and an opportunity we have to really think about our role in the efforts of the state of California. And, obviously there's the political role in terms of supporting various legislation, whatever. But it's going to be a big lift to do some of those structural systematic changes. And I don't know that I had really thought enough yet about how we fit in with what the state is trying to do from sort of like a physical, infrastructure. For example, if we end up with that pipeline, right? What sorts of things should we be thinking about that are not in the next 8 years, but are in the next 20 years, right? Say that medium term time frame. And I don't have any recommendations or suggestions, and I'm glad to know that our staff is connected to these, but I think that's an area we should be reflecting on, whether it's this group, a standing committee, a board, however it is that this work continues on. I think having something in that medium time frame that's a check-in on how do we work with the state on these broader actions. And then I confess I don't know very much about mineralization, so I was checking a little bit online. I guess a question for our technology working team. Are any of these sorts of technologies, let's say mineralization, for example, on the list of things our tech team is already considering look at?
Well, I can try to answer that. It's not part of what we were focusing on as a tech team, because we were looking, the focus right now is on building electrification of the tech team. But it is what we included in some of what early on in the ad hoc we discussed about things like construction material regulations. And as Diane had mentioned, this is something that we can actually do to accelerate adoption of these technologies and have it already start be part of our carbon reduction by through those measures, whether we produce them locally or not.
Okay, well, I think then just for us as an ad hoc, not today, that's just something that we need to put a pin in and think about how to move forward on. So again, thanks to our staff for taking an overwhelming and sometimes, dispiriting topic and breaking it down and helping us think about the various technologies we have available to us in addition to electrification.
Great. And Tom?
Yeah, I think everybody said it really was a good, wide-ranging presentation. Certainly a complex area with cutting-edge technologies that I think we'll see evolve rapidly. And it seems that carbon sequestration will be an important part of our solution to get to zero. And, I agree with the comments about, thinking of it as a portfolio and where's the low-hanging fruit. I think it'd be interesting to evaluate some pilot programs, potentially an algae farm, and biochar. On the canopy, I think we currently have a goal of increasing our canopy to 50% coverage. And I believe the Stanford students identified a portion of the canopy in the Baylands that we're not accounting for yet. We should certainly take steps to make sure we get credit for that. And then, as people have said, I think some of these industrial processes are going to require, a lot of land to operate, and it's going to be challenging, if not impossible, to do it in Palo Alto. And I do see a lot of benefits for supporting programs outside the city for offsets. And one of the ones that was mentioned earlier on today was, soil-based sequestration and farming. I think that's pretty interesting. Carbon can help restore the soil, but the farms need to operate in a certain way, not tilling the land and rotating crops and that kind of thing. And it just seems like if there are farms selling high quality offsets, it would be a good kind of win for us. Get the benefit of supporting farmers and the food supply, as well as offsetting carbon. And then again, I expect costs will continue to change, but it seemed to be some of the more cost-effective approaches today were things like larger algae farms and biochar plants. And if there are opportunities for us to participate in some of those, I think we should definitely look at that. And then we just had a brief mention about hydrogen, which I think is also very interesting for large-scale industrial and energy storage uses. And I think we should continue to monitor and look at those kind of things for those kinds of uses. But thanks again. It was a really good presentation today.
Yeah, thank you. Just following up on a couple of Tom's comments, the hydrogen field has just in the last 2 years been really transforming toward green hydrogen, which is basically the electrolysis using renewable energy to do electrolysis and generate hydrogen from splitting water. And both the Biden administration and then Europe are doing massive investments in attempting to scale that Denmark is already moving forward with now 2 new islands offshore that incorporate, they're basically very low cost and now at times surplus renewable energy to generate green hydrogen. And so that's a really kind of a very interesting model. And one other thing that I didn't mention on biochar that Tom alluded to on the agricultural amenity, the revenue model for these plants that do this pyrolysis had originally been primarily around the value of the renewable natural gas, and it's using it to generate electricity. The value of the biochar has gone up so high that that's typically the primary revenue stream. And biochar, when it's mixed in the soil, and this is a whole field that's being analyzed in its agricultural uses, but it basically facilitates greater agricultural output with less use of fertilizers and less use of water. And so it has multiple benefits in both sustainability more broadly and CO2 impacts more specifically. So these were really great comments and on a great presentation. Brad, we're now next scheduled to go to the public on this, is that correct?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Well, do we have members of the public who would like to wade in? And Brad, are you going to be able to see them and call on them? Is that the way?
Yeah, we'll call on them. And great. I see we have one so far. So Nielsen Buchanan. I think someone's going to promote Nielsen to a panelist so he can turn on his video if he likes while he makes his comments, and we'll do the same for any public speakers.
Sure, just 1 second. Okay, Nielsen, you should be able to speak for 2 minutes.
Okay, I think I'm live.
Yes, you are.
I appreciate having the opportunity to sit in on some of these, and it's a great education for me to see the scope of the problem and what one little city is doing. I have a comment about perception. Your efforts coming across as one city working very hard, and the problems, as you've been suggesting in the latter part of this discussion, really involve scale in other cities. And the more opportunities you can bring to the public of what you're doing, internally on a very local basis versus those opportunities, as you mentioned today, for scale using other cities. I personally would like to see an allocation of your time, X% for these internal city issues and X% for even collaboration with nearby cities. That's the role model I think means more to other cities. You're using the model that the lead bird in a formation of geese, the other geese are going to follow behind. I'm not sure humans do that. So the model I would think more cities would follow would be your collaborative model, where you can actually prove that you did something with other cities. That's just my bias on human nature. The other is to make it much more individualistic as you push it out to the public. I step back from all this and say, if I were going to invest $1,000 a year or get a whole bunch of people to invest $1,000 a year, what would I do? Would I plant trees in all the fire-ravaged parts of Oregon and California or not? But if you can step back at some point and say, well, how would we ask an individual to invest their own personal money philanthropically in this effort? That would give me a better idea of where I would have personal ROI, and it would match whatever my values are. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we have Judith Schwartz. So go ahead whenever you're ready, Judith.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. I think that what my main concern is that I thought it was a good presentation today about the whole idea of carbon sequestration and what you're doing and what can be done and what things are on the horizon. But it worries me when the same terms are being used interchangeably to mean different things. And the end result is that the community doesn't understand what's going on. So in your branding, you use carbon neutrality to mean one thing. This was using carbon neutrality in a completely different way. And I think that one of the things that I observe on Nextdoor and in articles and in conversations like this is that people think that what we're doing today is somehow that we have zero carbon electricity 24/7. And I think it's problematic because you can't really make good decisions if people don't know what you're talking about. And I think to distinguish between what is symbolic and aspirational and what is practical, if you're trying to ask, 21,000 out of 26,000 homes to be switched over to be all electric at great expense to the landlords, because we have 46% are rental units, I think these aren't realistic things for the way people behave. And I think, if you want to try and get everybody to take out their lawns and not eat any meat and all of the things that one would have to do to achieve all these goals, I just don't think it's realistic. And I think the staff is doing the city a disservice if you're using the terms interchangeably and misleadingly as a matter of branding. And I think you really need to get your language straight about what you're telling people. Thank you.
Thank you. And it looks like we also have Bob Winslow next. So go ahead, Bob.
Hi. First, I apologize. I actually shouldn't even be coming because I was with my mom traveling around with her, but I wanted to at least introduce some analysis I've been doing into the record, if you will. Briefly, I've been working on the international fate of our papers and plastics that go overseas, and have discovered in my analysis that while the city in their calculation of overall carbon emission or carbon footprint does not calculate the impact of overseas shipments, if it were to be counted, our annual shipments are approximately 11,000 tons a year from plastic carbon, 78,000 tons a year from mixed paper, and 150,000 tons a year from cardboard. So our 80-20 rule, we always need to remember that we're working through a framework that may actually need to evolve as we discover our impact. And equally, thinking of the earlier person's remarks on the geese or the ducks flying, I really do appreciate Palo Alto's leadership in this area, but I think where we're working to limit the social impact of our international shipments, but I also think it's a remarkable global impact. When I estimated the Palo Alto is 1/600th of the population of the state of California. So nominally, you can take the 230,000 tons and multiply that impact by 600 to anticipate what an incredible global impact we could have through our leadership. So I know it's maybe off agenda, but I wanted to share the analysis and the work we've been doing to understand the greenhouse gas impact of our waste management, even though we're unable to include it in what we would call our city's carbon impact. So those are my remarks. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bob. Just going to reset the timer, and then Tom, go ahead, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for setting up this opportunity to share how Palo Alto is looking at these issues. I think it's quite helpful. So I definitely agree with Mr. Buchanan and Mr. Winslow about the kind of the wonderful leadership that Palo Alto's explorations provide. And also it shows up to some extent in the slide of other cities pursuing carbon neutrality. I know over in Menlo Park, where I live, that was Palo Alto's leadership was one of the things that inspired our Menlo Park goal, as well as we wrote our plan. I think for me, the interesting thing, and I put it in the Q&A, is how to use the high cost of carbon capture and sequestration in its many forms as informative for how hard and fast to go now on avoiding the need to do extra amounts of that expensive CCS in the future, because everything we can reduce emitting now doesn't have to be extracted later and stored for eons somehow. So we already know, by looking at the cost of these things, we know what we have to do. And we can use this to inform how hard we have to do it and how far and fast we have to go, to overcome the kinds of inertia that another commenter brought up about noticing that, climate change is going to be expensive. And so we need to incorporate the idea that we understand the expense, and we see that doing it in these cheaper ways, it will make the total adventure less expensive than emitting now and trying to extract it later. Also, the recent IPCC report has gotten very clear about something, and that is that every new replacement fossil-fired device, water heaters, furnaces, etc., sticks out over the 2-degree target or the 2-degree limit. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will have John Kelly. John, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the presentations today, and I'd like to second what Council Member Cormack said about the effective use of video, particularly from Chris Field. I've been saying a number of things in the chat. I don't know if anyone's listened to it, but one of the things that I've found missing in today's presentation is the whole use of trying to reach carbon neutrality through effective carbon pricing, and more particularly, effective municipal carbon taxes. I've been talking about this for a while. I think that the recently announced IPCC Working Group 3 report, which was just referred to, and a citation of which I've put into the chat, speaks to this pretty clearly, particularly if you look at sections such as technical summary page 111. And I just want to read 2 of the high points from that. The first is, this is at line 28, carbon pricing is effective in promoting implementation of low-cost emissions reductions, high confidence. And then when you go a little bit further down in that set of conclusions, you'll see that part of the reason they're focused on low-cost emissions effectiveness is that people haven't experimented enough with high carbon prices. And the second is, I'm going to read this paragraph in full. Carbon pricing is most effective if revenues are redistributed or used impartially, high confidence. A carbon levy earmarked for green infrastructures or saliently returned to taxpayers correspondingly to widely accepted notions of fairness, increases the political acceptability of carbon pricing. I think this is really relevant to the members of the ad hoc committee who are here today. I believe that all of you have served on the finance committee, and I believe that all of you have proposed or at least indirectly supported the business tax that's proposed for the fall. And I would really like to hear from each of you why you are not instead proposing a carbon tax for Palo Alto to reach the goal of carbon neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Matt Schlegel. Matt, you have 2 minutes. Thank you. Matt, you should be able to speak now. Going once. Okay. Well, let's just keep Matt on there maybe, and we'll go to Sherry. Sherry, yeah.
Yeah, hi. So thanks for the presentation. It was great. I also really like the videos, and I generally appreciate all the work you're doing. I just had a couple quick comments. One was the Stanford student portfolio. Here are some things we could do to reduce our emissions. I didn't see the cost of that. You know, so for example, the direct air capture was a 3% component, but what was the cost that was assessed to that? Because I think that's coming down really rapidly. So that was just one question that I had. And then, you know, the other thing I struggle with, so buildings are so expensive to electrify and a pain in the ass. And, you know, I think the water heaters are maybe easier than the furnaces, but it would be so much cheaper and more effective for us to electrify buildings somewhere else. This is a very unpolitical thing to say, but, you know, we don't get much bang for our buck because we don't use that much gas because it's so temperate here, and the building costs are astronomical. But it's not a good thing to do that because you want to clean up your own mess first. So it's not just about price. There's something else that wasn't talked about here that I think is relevant, which is why you want to get local offsets and local whatever. But anyway, I found that missing. And I think if we were just to go on price, there's no way we would electrify our buildings, honestly. We would plant trees everywhere else. We would, you know, farm everywhere else, whatever. So what I would like a little bit more thought about, what are those other factors that go into this? I don't know. That's all I had to say, but thanks very much.
Thank you. And then Matt, if you still wanted to speak, please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So thanks for the presentation. In order to meet the 80 by 30 goal, clearly home electrification is going to need to happen. And I asked the question, and home electrification will get us to, I guess, 71% of emissions reduction by 2030. So it's a big contributor. I understand we're about at 40% now. So it's something that I feel we really need to do. And what I would like to see is that we establish yearly milestones for making progress on this so that we can track progress on a yearly basis to make sure that we are installing the heat pump water heaters and heat pump HVAC systems into at least single family homes, if not multifamily residential buildings as well. We should all be able to have visibility into that, because what gets measured gets improved, and so I'd like to just see that we're all on the same page as where we are on that. On a personal note, I electrified my house as of last Thursday. About 2 years ago during a heat wave, we put in a heat pump HVAC system, which had air conditioning. So that was nice. You get the benefit of the air conditioning as well as the heating. And then we installed the heat pump water heater last Thursday. So I think this is my 5th or 6th day of no methane flowing into the house, because we're already on an induction stovetop. So it can be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks so much for sharing that. Hope you're enjoying your electric home. Next, we have Chris. Chris, if you're ready, go ahead, please.
Off topic on the agenda, but I did want to kind of share kind of my belief that as Palo Alto is looking at reducing, impacting global warming in a big way, I think it's it's really, and I by the way, I live in Redwood City now. I recently moved, and I've communicated this to the Redwood City Council. I think it's very important to make sure that the incentives that City Council put forward, as a voice, they're more powerful than individuals, to the to CPUC and Pacific Gas and Electric, which I know they have your own utilities in Palo Alto, but making sure that there are incentives for people to switch to solar, right? And I'm sure most of you know that there's recently been a metering proposal change put forth by PG&E and CPUC to make it so that solar is effectively very expensive. And I mean, the entire solar industry lobbied heavily against this. Unfortunately, at the last minute, it's been pushed out, but it may very well come back. And the idea is that just to even connect to the grid, if you have solar panels, you'd have to pay something like $80 a month, which makes, I know personally people that dropped their solar plans and they said, forget it, I'm not going to do it because it's economically not viable. So people are coin operated, and if it becomes, a lot more expensive to do solar, they're not going to do it. And I know personally 2 people that did that. So I would encourage City Council, if there's any way you guys can influence City Council members to, I don't know, a colleague's memo or whatever you call it, a memo on behalf of City Council of Palo Alto to Governor Newsom, to the state, to encourage incentives around solar adoption. And that means not allowing PG&E who's got a CEO that just made $51 million last year, Patricia Poppy, not allowing them to do things like increasing rates for people that have solar. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Chair, that looks like that was our last speaker. So.
Great, great, thank you. Councilmember Cormack.
Yeah, okay to just respond to some of the public input as part of the conversation? Yeah. Okay,
Sounds
great.
Good.
Will do. Thank you so much. I know many of you listening have a lot more expertise in this area, and I really appreciate all your comments. I did just want to respond to a few of them. We don't get to do this in normal council meetings, so I don't think staff is being misleading about carbon neutral electricity. There's a difference between carbon free and carbon neutral, so I just wanted to state that for the record. We are, I took note about the question about how are we working with other cities in the state, and I've just asked our team to incorporate that into our FAQs. That's a really legitimate question, and I appreciate that being asked. The question about yearly milestones for installation of things, I know we get asked that a lot, and I remember asking last year at the birthday or 2 years ago, like, hey, what's the plan? How many are we doing each year? And I think what we've learned is that we're going to have to do that in lockstep with the improvements to the grid. So we can't just establish those, and you can't just take the number we need to do, divide by 8.5 and just lay those out, because we need to modernize our grid to be able to accommodate all of these electrical appliances. So that's work that is going to take a little bit longer, I think, than we anticipated, but I agree with the idea of having targets over time. They're going to have to be in parallel with the grid modernization. Question about carbon tax. Is staff, I don't know that we have legal here, so does staff have any response on the legality of a municipality establishing a carbon tax?
Jonathan, I think you've been closest to that. If you could hazard an answer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say this is something that it's a concept that we've talked about and thought about. It's something that we need to talk with more about our attorneys, and these are active discussions that we're having.
Right. So I just wanted to get that on the record. It's not a straightforward answer. And then the question about the sort of hypothetical about, like, well, if we were really doing this on a cost basis, would we be taking the money we're going to invest here and investing it elsewhere? And I think that it's a good thought exercise to go through that. As I often do, I think it's a yes and. We have to do our work here locally, and we also have to be open to what can we do in other parts of the region, other parts of the state, other parts of the world. So I think those two things have to go in parallel. And we have to accept that the costs are going to be different, right? So that's how I'm thinking about reconciling that dichotomy. Really appreciate the questions from the public, and just FYI, it's hard for those of us on camera to also track all the answers in the Q&A. I go back and forth as much as I can, but you know, the staff does capture all of that. So I just want to assure you that that work is being done. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And I'll just offer a few follow-ups to some of the comments that we had presented. One of the great things about this committee is that we really are having not only a high level of participation, but participation with people that have a broad range of experiences and expertise that they can contribute. So first, the comment that I think it was Nielsen Buchanan who made about the collaborations that we may do sub-regionally or regionally can have a real leveraged impact. Not only that it can be more efficient and cost effective if we, in some circumstances, would do a collaboration, but it also helps bring along those other cities, as Tom Cabot had mentioned, that we can accelerate their progress by collaboration as well. So I think that's really important. One of the speakers talked about, mentioned hitting 71% reductions from home electrification. And I just want to clarify that our home electrification plan for 80/30, which we're fleshing out and planning to bring to the council in the early fall, is a significant portion of our 80/30 goal. It is not how we will get to 80/30 or even to that 71%. The other major parts of it are, the largest is transportation and decarbonization of our transportation, and then commercial buildings, which are an even bigger proportion of the opportunity than home electrification. So those are all elements that we're going to have to tackle to get to even that 71% reduction that the current measures we believe can achieve, and then the 80% that we need to come up with additional measures to do. And then there were concerns expressed about home electrification costs, but one of the things that we're looking at in the technology team is a whole range of approaches, from the most important and immediate approach that was talked about is the need to assure that we don't put in new gas appliances going forward. So it's this end of life replacement, particularly on hot water heaters, because they have the shortest life of these home appliances. And when we look at that, the cost effectiveness of that is actually very attractive. If we're talking about everyone or people going all in one step to full home electrification, then that's a more expensive process, especially if the appliances that are used are high wattage appliances. So one of the things that we're pursuing is looking at how to have appliances, what appliances create the least demand on both the home upgrade and the utility system upgrade by being more efficient. And those can be on an appliance by appliance basis, but SMUD, Sacramento's utility district, which has been a leader in a lot of these efforts, they've come up with programs that are lower cost programs for whole home electrification, targeting moderate and lower income households that they needed to come up with lower cost programs. And that's a model that we're going to be looking at. And so we may have within Palo Alto essentially a Cadillac version and a Chevy version of electrification that allows people to choose what's most appropriate for them, and an incremental one rather than a whole home. And so those are all things that we're actively working on. And then lastly, even when we looked at how to get to a carbon neutrality, we talked about what we can do within our city boundaries, what we can do sub-regionally in collaborations, but we even have offsets, carbon offsets that are meaningful and an important stopgap bridge, I guess I should say. But a lot of those are not very transparent on how effective and really sustainable carbon offsets are. Bob Winslow was on the call, and he has initiated in collaboration with the state of Oaxaca, Mexico, and our sister city in Oaxaca, an offset program that is one where we know concretely the impacts. They are actually not preservation of forests, but reforestation, reestablishment of natural habitats, reestablishment of a sustainable water supply through that reforestation, employment of good, equitable jobs for indigenous people, and quantifiable carbon capture. And we're looking at talking with some of our sister cities on getting them to participate in that program. But it's the same sort of thing that our neighbors regionally may be interested in joining forces on, and having more meaningful carbon offsets as a complementary effort to our aggressive electrification and decarbonization that we're doing ourselves. So it's a multifaceted approach, and I think we're seeing better and better alternatives, lower and lower costs, and in many of these technologies, the ramp of cost reduction is accelerating, and this is going to be a dynamic period. That the cost anticipations for today versus 2026 versus 2030 are all different cost structures. And so we're going to have a series of decisions based upon looking at where we're headed as opposed to where we are today in technologies and costs. Let's see, I just want to make sure. Anyone else have any follow-up thoughts? Otherwise, I can turn it back over to Brad and Christine for next steps.
I'm not seeing any other hands, so I think we're ready to close. I'd just like to thank the staff who put together these presentations and found the video resources that were very helpful, and the working group and ad hoc, and all the members of the public who attended and shared their comments today. Much appreciated. And with that, we will close out the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.